and that is all about biomedical engineering. And then our last talk will be about global impact, the power of the NGOs shaping a sustainable future. So that'll be all about river conservation. And then we have our MAPS presentations that have been going really well. Our next one is March 21st, and it's called Adapt or Die, how the unfolded protein response allows cells to decide between responding to stress or a programmed cell death. And then our last event for MAPS is the Science Wizard. It's a really fun one for families. Bring your kids. It's very engaging, really entertaining. He's been to MJC before, and I saw him last time he was here. He was great. And then, of course, we have our Great Valley Museum. I have our hours listed here: Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, 9 to 3. If you have any questions about any events that are held at MJC, just let me know, and I will pass it on to our speaker. Switch over our viewport.
There we go. Thank you.
Okay, I am Denise Godbout-Savant, and I am on the Science Colloquium Committee with Georgette. And it's my privilege to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Susan Kerr. She grew up locally, a second-generation teacher here at MJC, so yay. And with fond childhood memories of running amok at Founders Hall. You younger ones won't remember that, but a long time. I do. While her father graded exams, because he was a professor here too. What did he teach?
Psychology.
Psychology, right. So she graduated from Grattan School and Houston High School and began her college career here at MJC, which is where she developed an interest in biology of humans, which led her to UC Davis and a Bachelor of Science in Anthropology. She focused on bioarchaeology, the study of human skeletons and archaeological sites, which led her to UC Santa Barbara for a doctoral degree. Her dissertation compared the genetics of the people of the Channel Islands off LA and San Diego. And she will be talking about the Channel Islands a little later. To bring that plug in. After living in Santa Barbara and Humboldt County, she returned to MJC in a structure here in 2000. She is currently a co-advisor for the Anthropology Club, a member of the MAP committee, and is also one of the founding advisors for In Local Roots and Shoots program, which was an organization started by Jane Goodall. Most recently, she collaborated with DNA experts and indigenous representatives in large-scale analysis of genomic data from the people who moved here from Asia to the Americas approximately 15,000 years ago, which led to a greater understanding of the different migrations into the Americas. She lives with her family on a small farm in Denair where they raise chickens, which hopefully are healthy.
And laying eggs, yay.
Yeah, good. 2 cats and 2 Labrador retrievers. I hand it over to you.
Thanks, Denise. Hi, everybody. I'm so happy to see you here so I can share my fascination with 5,300-year-old guy. So known as the Iceman, but he has other names, so we'll go over that. I actually, a while back, gave a science colloquium on the Iceman, so if anybody who's been around here a while as a faculty member might remember that one. So I'm going to kind of start off with the basics of who the Iceman is, what we knew about when we first discovered him. But really what I want to do is kind of say, what are some new things, new technologies that have been applied to his skeleton and ice mummified body. So let's sort of get started here. Because the Iceman has a local nickname. His name is Ötzi, and that is because his ice mummy was located, let me make sure I got the right pointer, there it is, in the Ötztal Alps here. So here's, Italy coming down here, Austria, etc. And here's the Alps. So it's right near the border between Italy and Austria. There was actually a little bit of a to-do when they found him about who got control of him. Turns out he was found like 10 feet inside Italy, so Italy won. Yeah. He is a natural mummy, so it's not like Egypt, right, where people were prepared for mummification. This is a process that just happened by accident. He died in a snowy glacial area, and there's lots of arguments about everything with ancient remains, right? But for the most part, it looks like he was fairly quickly covered with some snow, and that preserved him. They might have gone through some thaw periods. So you'll see in some of the images, some of his remains, like his cranium and his left buttock, have a lot more degradation than the rest of him. So he might have been exposed for little periods of time. So it's basically an accident that he was preserved. Why did they find him though, right? You think, okay, well, glaciers, why would you be up there in the Alps in this really isolated area? And why would the ice after 5,000 years all of a sudden melt enough that someone can find him? Well, what happens often or periodically is that there are hot winds that come from the Sahara across the Mediterranean, and they come into the Alps and they'll lay down red dust, and that increases the melting of the ice. And so folks who live in the Alps know that there's this sort of cycle that happens and there's a melting. Just randomly, a couple of hikers were around and they stumbled across his remains. So why do I pay no much attention to him? Why have I given 2 science colloquiums on Ötzi, as he's called? Well, for one, when I was in graduate school at UC Santa Barbara, my advisor, Philip Walker, was an expert in tattooing. And so he didn't publish on it, but he had researchers come into the lab periodically. We had some give some presentations on what they were doing with the ice mummy. And so I just kind of got interested in it because I knew more than the regular person did about what was going on with the studies. But also, fellow faculty member Gary Hayes and I have collaborated on a number of field studies trips. And in 2007, we decided to go to Italy and Switzerland. Sitting in my office right about a month before we left, and I'm looking at the itinerary going, we're going to be like really close to where Ötzi was found. I wonder if I could possibly get there. And so I ended up taking 20 of the group on quite an adventure that involved train strikes and missing trains and buses and all sorts of incredible things. But we got to the museum. There's my intrepid crew there. And we did actually get to go through the museum. If you ever get the chance, it is amazing what they have done. They have every single artifact on display, and as well as Ötzi himself. So I'll show you that as part of this presentation. So I've kind of spent a little bit of time thinking about it, but I hadn't thought about him too recently until I sort of started seeing some new stuff popping up. And so I thought, maybe now's the time to kind of see what we now know about Ötzi that we didn't know before. But you guys might not know much. So let me go back in time and tell you the story of Ötzi's discovery. So I told you that there were some folks hiking in the Alps and they came upon these remains. Now at this case, or at that time, you can see there's, the head here and the spine and the rest of it is in the ice. It was kind of an embarrassing situation for the folks who brought him out of the ice because they thought, well, I don't know. It's embarrassing no matter what. They thought it might just be a hiker that had died like the previous year or two and had gotten stuck. But they ice picked and got around and they, kind of hurt the remains while they were doing it. So that wasn't a good look. But they really just thought they had, something for a forensic person to study. But that was not the case because when they got him to the lab, they noticed that inside the ice that had come off with him, they started finding weird things that were not modern. So stone tools, wooden items that were sort of curious. So they decided to go back the next year and do some actual excavations to try to figure out what else might be there that they could learn from this now so-called Ötzi, the Iceman. And so here's them excavating a larger area from where he had been found. And they did a large-scale excavation. These are just some of the things that they had quickly picked up when they first found him, and that's what gave them the idea that he really wasn't a modern individual. I can't tell you everything they found. You have to go to the museum because there's over 400 artifacts that were found with Ötzi. Wide variety of things and amazing preservation for things that are 5,000 years old. So clothing, this is a goat skin tunic. He had a kind of a cape made out of reeds that would have, like been a windbreaker of sorts, and a nice bearskin cap, and some shoes. Remember that. There's also a bunch of tools. So stone tools, arrow with a quiver and a bow, so we'll talk more about the bow. And then this curious little axe here, which is a copper axe. And that led to even more curiosity because, well, copper was in use for a very specific amount of time in prehistory. So we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. So that's what they found. And of course, they wanted to start answering questions. What were the questions they wanted to answer? Well, how old was he? I've told you, but they didn't know when they first found him. What can we tell from the actual mummy itself? And then why was he there, right? Big question. Were people regularly hanging out in the coldest areas and the glaciers in the Alps? Because we know people were actively living in the lower elevations, but not, where it stayed snowy all the time. And then, of course, the big one, how did he die, right? The big forensic kind of question, even though he's old. All right, so let's go through these and kind of think about what the original researchers discovered as they went along. So when was he alive? Well, he had stone tools, which means that he could possibly be part of what we call the Stone Ages, right? And then he had a copper axe, which is part of what we might generically call the Metal Ages. So where did he fit? Well, let's see. We have to kind of do a little bit of a primer on the just most basics of European prehistory. So we can see that this is time depth, right? So we have the Neolithic or the New Stone Age, which is a little variable in the Fertile Crescent a little bit farther to the south. We're having the origins of agriculture, and that's what the Neolithic generally is associated with, farming. But in Europe, that kind of took a while to catch up to the areas that were further south. So the Neolithic is still kind of just barely getting into farming in Europe. So, finding stone tools and things like that would be perfectly appropriate for the Neolithic. But of course, he had that copper axe. And the Copper Age, they call it, dates to about 5,300 to 4,200 years ago. And so where did he fit, right? Was he going to be more towards the Neolithic, older? Was he going to be well into the Copper Age? Well, when they did some radiocarbon dating on the organic remains, he came out right smack dab in the middle, right? A little bit Neolithic, but very early into the Copper Age. And what I remember from when my advisor was talking about these things, it was that he literally had to adjust the date of the Copper Age a couple years, 100 years older, because of the radiocarbon date and his copper axe. So he actually changed prehistory with his object and the date that he was found. And the dates have all confirmed recently that it's about the same age. There's nothing questionable about the age area. So that's when he was alive. What can we tell from the mummy or his anatomy? Well, he was male. You might laugh at that and go, well, of course. But there was actually some question at first because some body parts were not visible. And people thought that maybe he had been castrated and cast out from his community. But it turns out that everything was really there. They just hadn't looked in the right places. So ice mummies get things moved around a little bit, like his stomach was shoved up here, so they just had to pay a little bit more close attention. From the skeletal analysis of both histological samples and other things, they could tell he was in his 40s. They predicted about 46 years old. He was a little shorter than me, 5'2", and estimate of his living weight would be about 110 pounds. Whether or not that's accurate depends on, how much he dried out, and, if they're estimating from sort of a slimmer mummy than he might have been during real life. We don't know for sure. Yeah.
Is that image in the presentation what people have discovered of it?
So this is an image that has been supported by the museum where he is now housed. So they had someone do an artistic reconstruction. The one I had on the first page was like the very first one that was done. And then this one is a little bit more up to date, though we'll talk about that and if it's totally accurate at the end as well. So. All right, so why was he in the Alps? At first, there was real confusion because there's not really a whole lot of evidence of a lot of trade going across the Alps, but he could have been a trader, except that he was not carrying a bunch of stuff. So if he was trading objects, why didn't he have things on him to trade? Was he a shepherd, and just got kind of lost with his flock? Don't know for sure. There's a lot of questions, a lot of little hypotheses tossed out there. And then he had some interesting things in his gear, including some plant remains that were known to be medicinal in purpose. So some folks thought, well, maybe he was a medicine man or a shaman of some kind. And of course, that triggers all sorts of, how did he get there? Did he do something bad and get chased into the Alps because he couldn't save someone? There was lots of craziness going on in terms of just what could it possibly be? Why was he there? But we get more and more information and we start learning a little bit more about how he died. So this was always the big question, right? How did he die? Different hypotheses, right? That maybe he was there. We know that he was there in sort of the late spring. Maybe there was a late storm, just got caught in it. Or maybe he got lost, right? But then someone decided to do an X-ray and a CT scan. And those X-rays led to a flurry of publications about how the Iceman might have died. So you can see from 2002 to 2007, we find that there's, and I'll show you the X-ray in a second, but they found a projectile in his shoulder inside. So if you haven't seen a full body image of the Iceman, he's like this. That's how he got stuck. And so they couldn't really see too well in his shoulder area. So the scan really helped them to see that he actually had been shot in the back and it had lodged in here. So now these are all the hypotheses about, hey, maybe his own people killed him because he did something wrong, or then finally, in June 2007, right as we were going on our field studies trips, like all of these things start getting published. It was pretty fun to have those things to talk about while we were in the actual area that he lived. And so I'll show you this next one, which is a National Geographic article talking about his death. So the last two of the publications were sort of most significant in terms of trying to recreate what happened to him. Because apparently he didn't just die by accident if he has a wound, but it could have been that that wound had been there and he was just living with it. So how do we know it happened at the time of his death? A very forensic kind of question to ask, right? Well, two papers came out that showed, I can't see the red thing, there we go. One of them is that he had a partially healed wound on his hand, right in this area. And that was perceived that it had happened 2 or 3 days before his death. And in fact, he had some sort of moss that was on that wound and in his hand when they discovered him. So maybe he was trying to treat it. So it is an active wound. Seems to suggest that maybe he had an altercation with someone and was injured a few days before he died. And then this stuff all over here is the x-ray that shows the point that's in his shoulder. And then some other work that was done that was a little bit more detailed showed a hemorrhaging that showed a really fast bleed out from that wound. So it hit one of the arteries. So that means it wasn't a wound that had been there for a long time and healed over. It was what he died from. He also was found to have had a head wound as well. So looks like he had some altercations with other individuals, made it through some of those altercations, but then ultimately succumbed when he was shot in the back with the point there. So that's sort of the main things that they wanted to know. But of course, there's 400 artifacts that were found with him, as well as some, the opportunity to look inside and around a frozen body and see what kind of things we can tell. We can look inside the stomach, right, and see what he ate. We could look at his tools and see what other objects he might have carried with him. What did that mean? He was a really well-prepared guy. He had lots of stuff with him. So some of the things that were done initially were to take some samples of his stomach remains. They found evidence of red deer and ibex meat, as well as some einkorn wheat. So this is farmers having some of the original versions of wheat. So he had some of that in his intestines. He also was covered, and then in his gut, they found different kinds of pollen. And the hornbeam pollen suggested that he had been recently in an area where it was prevalent, which would have been, that's how they got the idea that he was present in the early spring, because that's when that pollen is the highest amount. All right, and then he also had those interesting things I was telling you about, medicinal kinds of materials, like some mushrooms that weren't necessarily edible, this birch fungus, some mosses. And so he had some of these in his packs, and he also had some of them in his system. So what these mean, various things, right? Some of the birch bark is actually known to be useful as tinder to start a fire, but some of it is actually known to be medicinal in purpose. So he was, like I said, a pretty well-prepared fellow. He had a lot of tools. One of the things that are most amazing were these birch bark containers. And if you go to the museum, they literally have the whole stack of them. And he had little lids and little bases, and they were all sewn up. So you basically go to a birch tree, right, and you cut around the top of the tree, and then you cut down about 6 to 8 inches, pop it off, and then just close it again and make a lid and a bottom, and you've got a container. So that's what this little guy is right here. And then he had his medicinals and food and stuff inside those. He had stone tools, as well as sheaths and things where he kept his tools. He had a quiver that had it was deer skin, and it had all of these arrows in it. He had a wooden longbow, only partially made, which is a thing of interest. I do actually, when we went to the museum, got a recreation of one of the tools that was found with him, which is a stone tool preparation. So this is used when you've used a stone tool and you now want to kind of resharpen it, or if you need to make the edges of it extra sharp, you use one of these. So if you want to come up and look at it afterwards, you can do that. But that little guy right there. So they had, recreations at the store you could buy. So I got one of those. So that's kind of what we knew about the time when I had done my visit to the museum, but, we have science that advances, right? New methods, new techniques, new tools. And a lot of these have gone over things that the Iceman had been studied in the past, but then we get a little bit more clarification. And then other things were completely new, hadn't been done since about 2010. So I'm kind of looking at since about 2010 to now, what's changed in the knowledge of the Iceman. This is what it looks like when they go into his refrigerator to look at him, but they don't bring him out very often. They have very strict limits on how long he's allowed to come out of that area. And you have to have applied for an okay to go in and do the research and prove that it's valuable, because every minute that he's out of the extra frozen room, he's decomposing, right? So we can't do anything with him unless it's really new and valuable, because we don't want to harm him anymore. I mean, he's probably the most studied, prodded, x-rayed, whatever person that's ever been in prehistory, because he's given so many different opportunities to study, but they try to limit sampling and things like that to things that are the safest and least intrusive. All right, so we can kind of revisit some of the things that I talked about before, and then get a little bit more information. So where did he come from, right? We know he was in that Utsul Alps area when he died, so here's about where he was found. But did he live to the north, or did he live to the south? How would we know? Well, archaeologists have a number of techniques that they can use to recreate where people came from. And they're not necessarily archaeologists who do the job. We give those jobs off to chemists who do things like paleoethnobotany and chemical analyses of things. But one of the things, the hypothesis has been that he probably came from an area south of, so here's the Andes range, the Alps range. I've been talking about human adaptations in the Andes in class, so sorry. And this little red dot seems to be where a lot of Copper Age archaeological sites have been found. So, maybe that's where he came from. The most famous one here is a site called Latch in this larger valley. But there's another site called the Schloss Joval, where people were living in the Copper Age as well. And it seems logical. It's the easiest path to where he was from this valley rather than from the north. So we can also look at other things to see, well, maybe where his connections were. Was he more connected with north of the Alps or south of the Alps? Well, why don't we look at some of his tools and figure out where those tools came from? So metallurgists have done some research with that copper axe and found that by doing mass spectrometry and electron microscopy, they found that the samples came from Tuscany. So the copper he used came from Tuscany. They did a huge study of a bunch of different copper axes in this whole region of Europe and found that many came from Tuscany and then others from the Balkans north of the Alps. But if you are from that valley I just showed you, generally your copper comes from Tuscany. And if you are north of the Alps, your copper comes from the Balkans. So there seemed, as they suggested, at least for metal trade, there wasn't very much movement. If you lived in the north, you got your copper from the north. If you lived in the south, you got your copper from the south, which was interesting because people thought that, you would trade across the Alps for important things. So that was something new that had come up in 2017, tying him a little more closely to the south than the north. Now this one's, there's a long quote here, but I kind of like it. So I kept a couple of the longer quotes from some of the articles. What were his last days like? So originally, someone did a study with some pollen in the stomach system and found that there was some variation in the pollen that suggested he was at different elevations over time. They weren't quite sure how long it was, but they knew that he had gone from low elevation to high elevation, down to low elevation, and then back up to high elevation, because of course, as you inhale, you're inhaling pollen from the areas that you're in, and those vary based on temperature and altitude. So looks like in his last, with the newest research, they actually can say within the last 3 days, he did this movement. So that's a lot. That's like 10,000 feet up and down and up again. Why would you do that? Unless you had to, right? So if someone is pursuing you for some reason, you're on your way, and then you see them, you come back down to, hide. You think maybe you've lost them, so then you go on your journey again, but maybe they were waiting for you. The other thing that's interesting about this is the newest research in 2019 shows that he actually, on his second trip up, took the hardest route that he could have taken. So he didn't go the easy way, the trade route through the Alps. He went up a really steep route. So it seemed maybe like he's trying to avoid where people are and go somewhere else. So all of these little pieces are kind of coming together to tell a fuller story of what was going on. Now we know that he had deer and einkorn wheat and ibex, but you probably didn't know that you can literally look inside the stomach and tell what layers of food were there and which one came last. So these researchers in 2012 found that the stomach, like I was saying, had kind of shifted from where it should have been and was kind of hard to find, but they found it. And they thought, okay, well, maybe we can get a better sampling of, the idea of where the food was rather than just what we had. And they also did some DNA studies to discover what the species were. And they found that nothing really was new in terms of species. It was still the deer, the ibex, and the wheat. But the ibex was the last one. And that he'd had it literally only, an hours or so before he died. So just to know a little bit more about this guy. Speaking of your gut, you can also figure out what was in his bacterial system, in his intestines and his stomach, right? So we all know that our microbiomes are important and they have implications for our health, right? So some folks decided that, well, maybe we could learn a little bit about the evolution of the microbiome if we can study the remains inside Ötzi and see which bacteria are present, do evolutionary studies on them to see if they're the same or different as what we have now. And this is beyond my anthropological training to fully explain, but I can tell you that the result was that there were a few bacteria that are disease-causing bacteria that were actually present in Ötzi's stomach. So we know that he could have been afflicted with similar diseases as we are today. And that they were slightly different. So we can see how things might have changed. This is really interesting, right? Who thought that archaeological specimen could help us with our health today, right? But we do have an opportunity to learn things like that from him. Now, the next thing is really kind of amazing. When they were doing one of their scans, they took a sample from a blood vessel because they wanted to tell some things about the timing of his death. And they actually got an image of a red blood cell. Actually, there's a number of them. This is just one. So this is a an atomic force microscope that kind of shows the shapes by pressures. And they say, I'm going with them, they say that this is the world's oldest red blood cells that are intact. I'm not sure if that's human or not, because I remember a story about dinosaurs that had some, but I'm gonna have to go look up that one. They also discovered that in the blood, there were some components that showed that it hadn't clotted, which of course supported a little bit that hemorrhaging idea, right? He hemorrhaged out, like the proteins that are present for clotting hadn't yet even started. So he died quickly, apparently. So interesting blood studies. There's one anthropologist, archaeologist, who's done a lot with what they call his medical kit. All of the plant remains and other things that seem to be related to health issues. And when you look at the paper, like the number of health issues he had is striking. And this is not all of them, but I decided to list some of them that were kind of more closely related to what was in his medical kit. So he had Lyme disease. They discovered that at some point. And he also had, so I kind of color coded here, the sloe berries are something that has been hypothesized to help with treating Lyme disease. And so the idea is that maybe he had those and was managing the effects of the Lyme disease with the sloe berries. Again, this is something that if that turns out to be true, we might be able to take some knowledge from that and help people today that have Lyme disease. The guy who's been working on that has only recently started working on doing the tests to see if it really is a valid thing. So poppies, right? So opium kind of thing could have helped with arthritis. And then he had that cut on his hand, and he had the fungus and some mosses that have antibacterial and anti-inflammatory qualities, and that's what was on the wound that he had on his hand. Now, other things that he had, in his intestine, he had whipworm, and they also found H. pylori in his stomach. So he might have had been having an ulcer or close to having an ulcer. Gallstones in his gallbladder. He had hardened arteries, so he had buildups inside his blood vessels. He had the arthritis. He had abscesses on his teeth. He had periodontal disease, which is, the retraction of the gums from not caring for your teeth. And he had that cut. He had some healed fractures of his ribs, and that was from a while ago. And then he had these lines on his fingernails. So here's the fingernails. And just like, your teeth and your bones, the things grow as you grow up. And then nails, of course, keep on growing, right? We always have to clip them. So they can be markers of recent stress. And the lines on his fingernails suggested that he'd had a lot of periods of stress in the 6 to 8 months before he died. So those are some other newer things that have been found out about his health. Now, I kind of referred to this at the beginning, that he has tattoos on his body. And they've been mapped and photographed and then worried over. It's like, what do they mean? Some of them are just like little lines. There's this cross right here. There's the lines on the wrist, and then some lines up here. This is a tool that they think might have been used for making the tattoos. They would have been most likely just a little wound, and then they know that they're made of carbon, so they probably would have taken some charcoal or ash and rubbed them into the cut to make the tattoo. But why does he have them, and where are they? Well, they've done some more recent research with mapping the tattoos. So here you can see how his arm is, across there. And these are all the places where he has sets of tattoos. They've done a number of different comparisons And it seems like not all of them are true, but many of them are in places where he has underlying arthritis or had the broken bone. So there's a little bit of suggestion that maybe these are pain relief tattoos, right? To treat the pain in a certain area. They actually also correspond, a number of them, to known acupuncture points. So that kind of leads some evidence that maybe that might be true, that those were marking a place that needed treatment. So kind of interesting stuff with the tattoos. And most recently, they did a few of what's called mitochondrial DNA studies a while back, and they were a little confusing because it didn't quite show that he'd come from anywhere. But now they've done some what we call full genome, so the nuclear DNA analyses. And some things popped up that were not as expected, including the fact that when they look at the genes for skin pigmentation, he seems to have the pigmentation that's darker than was expected from the previous studies and looking at his remains. You know, did he get washed out maybe? So that reconstruction that I had at the beginning, now someone in the article put this one in there and said, well, could this be what he really looked like? The other things that they found were that he had brown hair and brown eyes, and that he had the gene for baldness. Maybe he was actually bald. He didn't lose his hair after he died. We don't know because his head was more damaged, so he didn't really get much hair off of his remains. He had blood type O. How do you represent that? That's the cutest way I could find to come up with. Show he had blood type O, instead of just blood all over the floor. But then also they found some other interesting things about his relationships. So I told you that he was somewhere after the Neolithic, but that farming hadn't really gotten to be as popular in Europe as it was in the areas where it began 10,000 years ago. So it was still relatively new. And so there's still a lot of people in Europe that are doing what we call hunting and gathering. So not being sedentary, not doing agriculture or farming in any way. So there are people here who are hunters and gatherers, and then there are farmers that have been living in the same area. So what they wanted to know was, where did his DNA fit? Was he tracking with the hunters and gatherers, or was he tracking with the farmers? And it turns out that his DNA is not exactly like, but more like that of the farmers than the hunter-gatherers, and more than they expected. So that was kind of an interesting result that they came up with. So he has more genetic ties to, you know, agricultural regions here than with the hunting and gathering regions up there. Now, one other thing that was kind of a quirky discovery was the fact that he actually was lactose intolerant. So there's a gene that you can get as a marker that tells you if you can digest milk successfully. Now, of course, we're mammals, so we can all digest milk when we're babies, right? But at some point, the gene goes into the off position and we become weaned and we eat solid foods. In populations that depend on agriculture, farming, and animal milk, that gene has been selected to stay on. So given that he was part of a farming community, the expectation was that he would have this lactose tolerant gene in the on position, but they found that he didn't. And so that suggests that perhaps lactose tolerance was slower to evolve in farming groups than they had previously expected it, because generally over 90% of Europeans are lactose tolerant. He's clearly European, but he is not. So, you know, over the last 5,000 years, something significant changed, and there was some sort of acceleration in the adaptability of being lactose tolerant. All right, so that's the end of the what we know now. Do you guys have any questions about that kind of stuff before I give you sort of an update on him and yeah?
Yeah, one of the things I noticed when you showed where the mummy was, where they were investigating him, it looked like his arms were extremely long compared to, contemporary humans.
You know, no one's noticed that. They've measured pretty much everything about him. So I would have thought they'd have said something if it was unique. Maybe it's just the angle of the picture or something. Yeah.
Modification, why, probably why.
Well, his body probably moved.
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, sorry. So the question was, I said that the body parts had moved. How and why would they do that? So the hypothesis is that as he was freezing, right, he maybe tumbled. And so things could have shifted, but also just as things shrink, they move from where they're expected to be because there's less water in them. So there's a couple of reasons why that could be. All right, so where is he now? And I kind of alluded to this, but I'll tell you a little bit more specifically here. He was found right in the Utsul Alps up here, 10 feet within Italy. So he actually was taken to Austria and Innsbruck first to be studied. And then they had the, oh, wait a minute, where was he really? And after about 5 or 6 years, they finally figured out that he was Italian. So they built this museum for him, updated it, and in 1998, he was moved into this museum in Bolzano. This is sort of what it looks like. I couldn't take pictures when I was there, so you're gonna have to go yourself. But I can tell you, here's the life reconstruction. You get to walk around and kind of see him in his outfit. And then you get to go to this little window and look in on his refrigerator. So you can look at the actual remains, which was some of the things they debated, right? Should we let people gawk at him? But they figured for educational purposes, it was, the best thing to do. He's kept, again, at that very cold temperature so that he doesn't degrade. But they hope that they can do a little bit of research as they're working on it. That kind of makes you reflect, though, on, why are we finding the Iceman? Why did we find him? The glacial ice is melting. And while his instance was probably one of those summer winds that came in that just reduced the ice enough for these people to find it. These very places where Ötzi was found, as well as all across the Alps, and of course all of our iced areas, are melting rapidly now. And it's a conundrum, right? Because archaeologists are like, wow, we can walk on places we never could before, and we're finding really cool things, but it's a disaster for the planet, right? So I liked what this guy said. It's like one tiny instance where climate change is affording the opportunity to learn something about the past. It's the teeniest of silver linings. And this is a comparison in Norway of an area from the early 1900s and then 2023 to show how much of the ice has melted. Norway has a lot of places where the ice has melted and discoveries have been made. There's a couple of really famous ones. One of them is this tunic that's about 500 years old that was kind of folded up and left on a rock, and then the ice had covered it, and now it was exposed. And they actually did a lot of experimental archaeology trying to figure out how this was made and what fibers were used and things like that. So it's kind of cool. And then a ski that was found in the similar area. And this is not just Norway. In Alaska, they've been finding exposed remains all over, everywhere that the ice is melting. So it's kind of like the archaeologists who don't want to fire in Yellowstone, but when it happens, they can see archaeological sites they never could have seen before, right? You don't want it to happen, but when it does, there's some things you can learn. So I also like to think about the Iceman, the fun things about the Iceman. There's been a number of folks who think that there's a curse on researchers who have worked on the Iceman. It's a ridiculous notion, but it's kind of funny to see that periodically, even the BBC will say, hey, this guy worked on the Iceman and he died and we don't know quite why. But his family, of course, said, no way, that's ridiculous. And when you see the number of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of researchers who have worked on Ötzi and know that there are a few people who've died, well, you know, that's just normal. So now, can anybody tell me why there might be a connection between Ötzi and Brad Pitt? The Mummy? Genetic, good thought. You ready? He's got a tattoo of Ötzi on his arm. So someone noticed that and sent a message to his publicist like, hey, this is Archaeology Magazine, so they're showing this. And it's like, hey, why does he have that? Well, we don't know. But, you know, of course, Ötzi had a lot of tattoos. Brad Pitt likes tattoos. Maybe there's a connection there. We'll see. And then there's some other oddities that you might be able to experience yourself. When we were at the museum, they had the Ötzi drink, which was, you know, like a Red Bull kind of thing. And someone has been inspired by Ötzi's sandals to make the Iceman line of shoes that you can actually buy. And I just thought it was hilarious to look at these really cool people with their, and then the Ötzi shoes on them. And if you want to look that up, the store is the Ötzi Iceman store. So then you'll get to get some of Ötzi's shoes. So thanks for coming. If you have any questions, that would be okay to ask, but I do wanted to show you that there is a website that has amazing information on it. They have really upped the game on the museum where he is found, the South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology. If you go to this website, you just can go to drop downs and it will tell you all the researchers, all the links to the documents, all of the things that were found with him, all of the different hypotheses. I wish I had known about it before I started writing this presentation. I found it like yesterday. I'm like, oh, look at that. I wouldn't have had to work. No. So check that one out. If you want to know more about it, you can email me. I can send you the link. I would open it here, but takes a little while and falters a little bit as it goes to the website. I guess it's one of those European connections. It's not too fast. So any more questions about, let's see. Yeah.
So earlier, one of the things with him was a quiver and several arrows. And then you mentioned something about a partially constructed longbow. What did you say?
Yeah, I forgot to mention that when I was talking about the going up and then going up, down again. So the longbow, apparently he lost one because he was making a new one and it was halfway made, but he hadn't polished it and finished any of the sinew. They found the sinew in one of his containers. So that sort of supports the idea that maybe he broke it in some sort of altercation and was trying to kind of restock his stuff while he was preparing. Thanks for saying it. I'm sorry, I forgot. Yeah. Oh, they made it up. We don't know. Yeah, so the Ötztal Alps was where he was found. And so he's also called, I think, the Steinlen, I can't remember exactly, don't quote me, man. But the Ötzi's catchy, right? So that's how he got his name. Yeah. So the idea is that he fell down, right, died, and then he got quickly covered. And even if he moved, he might have moved this way. So it just got stuck. And you're not going to undo it at this point, right?
Why this thing up and down through specific up the Alps and into the valley, like what work he was trying to do? Is there any indication he was a farmer and that
That was the mystery, right? Because it doesn't make sense, especially like if you're a herder or something, why would you go up and down? So the most commonly and most supported hypothesis is that he was on his way for whatever reason. He got attacked, came back down to avoid the attackers, thought he had avoided them, took a slightly different route to avoid them, but they found him and killed him. So for some reason, we don't know why, someone wanted to kill him. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
Is it common for people at that time to have that many completions at that young age?
Well, we never knew, right? And we don't know. He's really a unique specimen. Generally, what we find are skeletons that when we look at skeletons, we can see some diseases, but not all. Like, so I can't tell from a skeleton if someone has hardened arteries or any of that kind of thing. So yeah, he's unique in that we have so many tissues of his that we can study. I mean, he was fairly old for his time. It's not old, but not a youngster. It's hard to say because as with today, you're gonna find people who are gonna last a long time, and then some who will die younger. But I'd say it's less than ours, so probably like 60. So, yeah.
You had the slide with his med kit and his diseases. Is that assuming that the med kit wasn't a general kit, but more specified to his own patient?
Well, maybe both, right? You probably had these things with you, but then he probably also had some that were specific to the things that he was experiencing. So that's an interesting question, and it changes every time they study the DNA. The original DNA studies suggested that he had no living relatives because it was done with mitochondrial DNA. It gives you broad patterns. With the full genome DNA studies, it was kind of weird because they kept finding that he didn't relate to anyone that was around where he was found compared to modern Europeans. The closest they could come was Sardinia, which is down in the south in the Mediterranean near Italy. And so the idea is that he's only related to them because they are kind of an isolated population and probably have like the oldest DNA around. And so he's unique because he shares this ancient DNA pattern. Everybody else in Europe has probably been kind of diluted by all of the motions throughout Europe, and they have new DNA that's come in. So that's why they thought he didn't have any modern relatives. It's probably just that his is older DNA, ours is younger, and we're not seeing the links. So it's kind of hard to say. Yeah. All right, well, one shameless plug. Actually, two. I have to advertise for Gary Hayes because I just saw him yesterday and he's like, oh, I'll advertise yours if you advertise mine. So there's 2 field studies that are coming up this summer. One is geology of the Colorado Plateau, an amazing experience, and that's in June. So visit Gary Hayes for that one. And then Terry Curtis and I are going to be going to Santa Cruz Island in August. So if anybody has any questions about that, I have some flyers up here you can pick up and let me know if you're interested in that. And if there's no other questions, thank you guys again for coming.